So as you probably remember, DISC is really all about communication style. It's all about ideal work environments and those settings where we really thrive. It also can point out for us those areas where we might not thrive and where we have to adapt. For the purposes of our call today, I also want to remind you about like what's high and what's low and what do we do when we're in the middle. So when we talk about high styles, those high styles are going to be the bars that really are above 70. And when we talk about the low styles, we're really talking about those bars that are under 30. Now, if your bar is somewhere in the middle, chances are pieces of both of these might be true for you, or maybe it's just not quite as extreme. So for instance, if you are a 60 C and we're talking about the high C style, chances are there's quite a few things about that style that feel true for you, but it might not be to the extreme nature that we're describing it. And you might also have some of those low C characteristics that feel true for you as well. So another thing I want to bring up is when we talk about DISC, we often talk about them as very separate indicators. We sort of talk about them in silos. It's the easiest way to sort of get across ideas. But the truth is, none of us are just one DISC characteristic or one bar. We don't operate in one silo. So chances are you will be parts of what we describe and so much more. Or you might feel like, well, there's something that you said that's the opposite style that's true for me. That could either be from some other DISC bar. It could be from your motivators. It could be from some family tradition that you've had your entire life. I mean, it can come from somewhere else. So just remember, we are much more than the single silo that we're going to describe, but sometimes for the sake of having these conversations, it's easiest to break them up. Okay, so I saw this recently and thought it would be a great place to remind us of different ways that we talk about the indicators and how we really deal with them. So dominance, for instance, whether it's high or low, that really it really looks at how we personally like to address problems and challenges. Influence has to do with how we like to handle situations around people and contexts. That steadiness is really about pace and consistency, or maybe lack thereof when it comes to consistency. And the C really is how we react to procedures and constraints. So sometimes these words can also be really helpful for us to frame some of the ways that we think about these characteristics and why sometimes you do have that crossover between them. So when it comes to the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, this does not apply when it comes to communication. If we want to be successful communicators, we should not communicate with others the way that we want to be communicated with. We should communicate with others the way that they want to be communicated with. So learn what that is. And so hopefully today you can get a few of those ideas. Even if you have family members, friends, colleagues that have not taken the DISC assessment, if you spend much time with them, you can probably figure out what most of their styles are and then be able to engage in their communication styles. So while we said the highs again are focused really on those scores over 70 and under 30, it's also really important that we talk about the bridge. So if you have one bar between 30 and 70, as we describe that indicator, you may feel like parts of both the high and the low descriptors are true for you. Or you might feel like, yes, that's true, but just not quite to that intensity. For bridges, if you have all four bars between 30 and 70, chances are this is going to feel true for you across all of the DISC indicators. Do we have anybody on the call today who is a bridge? who has all 4 bars between 30 and 70? Kelly is, yes. Angelique too, great. Kate, yeah, almost all of them. Sandra as well, quite a few of you. So again, please, as you hear the high and low, again, if you're over 50, chances are you will relate to more of the high qualities. It just might not be quite that extreme. And for those of you that have scores under 50, you'll relate to more of the low qualities. Could be some of the highs as well, but again, just not to that intensity. Any questions about like the high or low DISC scores, what it is to be a bridge, or anything along those lines before we really dive into DISC and stress? Kate, that's a really good question. I opened up the chat channel for a second so I could see how many bridges we had. And I know I can't keep the chat channel open for long or else I get really distracted, but it's a great question about how steady are our DISC scores over time. We see different things between students and adults. So let me start with students in the K-12 space. When we see younger students, especially if you're starting in middle school or like freshmen in high school, when we see that, if they already have some extreme bars, so again, those bars under 30, those bars over 70, we do suggest, or we do see that those are generally going to stay in those more extreme realms. We don't see those high I, really chatty, Kathy, enthusiastic, optimistic people who are like 70, 80, 90 I's. Even as they get older, they don't generally come down a whole lot. Sometimes they may even increase the intensity of that I. The same is true for the low scores. I know I am, my D score is, sometimes it's 4, sometimes it's 6. I think I've seen it as high as 7. I've never been a 40, 50 D. I've always been a really low D. And that's okay. Keeping in mind that like high and low does not correlate to words like good or bad. Actually, the high and the low indicators have their own gifts and strengths and talents around the way that we communicate and the way that we really behave. So remember too, when we talk about DISC, that we're not encouraging our students to change from what they are or to change over time, but really to feel like how can you utilize and make the best of what is true for you. Now, when we see bridges in students, so they've got all 4 bars between 30 and 70, sometimes it's because they truly are those flexible and adaptable people. They really are just sort of that middle of the road, go with the flow. And sometimes in our students, we see it because they haven't quite figured themselves out yet. That's also why we recommend that students take the assessment every 2 years, because they really are growing and changing. And so we want them to be able to see areas where they're sort of coming into their own. For those of you that are bridges as adults, you probably are that flexible, adaptable person, and you probably always have been. There could be things that you might be muting down in your workplace, and we would see that in your adapted style. But really for adults, we don't see much shift over time. I think it's also important to note that when we talk about shift, we're talking about changes of 20 points or more. So if you tested, and like this one right here is a 63, and you take it a year later and you're like a 72, that's not actually a whole lot different, and we wouldn't consider that a shift or a change.